You can hear me, right? Yes, yes. Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start. Please take your seats. This is probably the only event in Israel that's going to start on time. Well, it's actually because we got Swedes on staff. So that's our secret weapon. I am very excited to announce our next speaker, Melissa Jane Kronfeld, who grew up in New York and studied international relations, international law, national security, and Jewish philosophy at George Washington, New York, Rogers, and Bar-Ilan universities, to name a few. Basically, I haven't accomplished nothing next to her. A published author, journalist, college lecturer, political advisor, and social impact consultant. She has served on the board of over 40 nonprofits only. Melissa has been featured. Melissa has been a featured speaker at conferences around the world, including the United Nations, the White House, and Capitol Hill, and is a regular commentator on print, television, radio, and podcast news. So that's just a little bit of our next speaker. How I came to know of Melissa is actually from one of her publications on the Israeli media that really, really impacted me. I contacted her later and I said, this right here, this is the heart of the Temple Mount. Like, this is voicing the heart of the people in such a special way. And I said, first of all, we got to meet, hopefully, if you can. And they were gracious enough, both her and Rabbi Levi, who is, by the way, her partner on On The Har. So they started a Temple Mount advocacy organization called On The Har. You should check them out online. They're doing amazing work and actually trying to bring in people into the Temple Mount that basically would have probably never touched the subject. So to name a few, they had Ben Shapiro, and I believe also Jordan Peterson slid in there as well, quietly. And so just to give you an idea of the kind of people that they have been able to bring up there and to share their impact and how they view the Temple Mount. And so before Dr. Melissa gets up to speak, I would like to play a clip of one of those tours that they had hosted Ben Shapiro up on the Temple Mount, and then Melissa will go up and speak.
Hi, it's Dr. Melissa Jane Kronfeld and Rabbi Yehudah Levi from On The Har, and we're up here on the Temple Mount today.
So last time you went up, what did you experience?
Well, I mean, we obviously walked around the outside of the compound. We got around to toward the front of the Dome of the Rock, and a bunch of members of the Islamic Waqf came over and started screaming at us to not daven. And so we continued around. One of the women, who I guess sit up there all day, started screaming at us, Allahu Akbar. The Mishnah came over. They told us basically that either they're going to arrest the guy or we have to leave Har Bayit. So instead of us making all the way around the outside here, we ended up exiting out the corner. So that was the story, yeah.
There's massive destruction on the Temple Mount of actual antiquities and artifacts. You can still see actual rocks, pieces of marble from the Second Temple that are treated like garbage up there. We were able to quietly pray up there. There are people who are up there every day attempting to fight for the civil right to pray on the holiest site in Judaism.
I mean, listen, I wish we could all daven openly there. That would be the freest thing to do. And the only place that Israel's an apartheid state is only on Har Bayit. That's the only place.
Up to the first step over here.
They've been able to do so much hard work to open it up over here and make sure that people can even daven a little bit. It's an incredible thing. And you can see the sort of bigotry that's faced simply for walking up here and davening a little bit. And thanks to these guys for doing all the hard work day by day to expand the access to people who have an original claim to the site.
Hi, everyone. How are you? I'd like to start today with a moment of silence for Israel's security forces across the country who are defending our freedoms, specifically the brave men and women of the Israel police who are serving on the front lines in Jerusalem generally, and the Old City specifically, and most especially for those stationed on the Temple Mount during these tense and volatile times, many of whom I am fortunate now to call friends, and who accompany me each and every single day on my ascensions to Har Bayit and protect my freedom of worship there as best they can. Freedom is actually what I'd like to talk to you about today. On January 6, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered what many historians, and scholars, myself included, consider to be the most important, defining, and critical speeches in American, if not human, history. His remarks, listened to on the radio waves across the world, laid out a clear and concise vision for the future, a simple but sound framework applicable to all mankind, a set of universal beliefs upon which civilization could not only survive, but thrive. In the future days which we seek to make secure, FDR began, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression, everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, and the fourth is freedom from fear. That is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and in our own generation. Indeed, FDR not only saw clearly what the future could be, but also what we must demand it should be. In essence, he reminded us that freedom was inviolable, indispensable, imperative, and that men and women must be free. Free to speak his or her mind, free to honor his or her faith, and to be free from wanting to do so, or worse, fearing to do so. It was this vision and his unfailing belief in freedom that led the Allies to victory, built the modern international state system, toppled the Soviet Union, and ensured democracy, the only form of government in which freedom will be secure, would spread across the world. Freedom is the foundation upon which the legitimacy of our national and international laws rely, and freedom is the prerequisite for any civilized society. And there's no doubt that by any measure or metric, the world is today more free than at any other time in human history. And in light of the Passover holiday, in which we now find ourselves, freedom feels more tangible and real than ever. For it is during this time that the Jewish people celebrate our freedom, freedom from slavery and freedom from exile, as well as the freedoms we have secured by establishing a Jewish state in this Jewish land, which affords us the freedom to live a Jewish life, practice our Jewish faith, honor our Jewish heritage, and look forward to a Jewish future free from the horrors of generations past. But in reality, the fight for freedom is not won. Because to celebrate freedom when the Temple Mount is held captive by rioters, criminals, and terrorists, aided and abetted by the Israeli government, which refuses to demand from them what they demand from me, feels foolish, futile, and feckless. I stand here today before you not as a victim of oppression, but a survivor of it. One of the countless foot soldiers fighting against the authoritarian policies which deny me of my fundamental human right to freely express myself on the Temple Mount and to freely worship God on the Temple Mount. I stand here today before you as one of the countless faithful who are not afforded the freedom from want, the want to access the Temple Mount at any time, on any day, from any entrance, for any reason, with any object of religious meaning. I am one of the many Jews who is not afforded the freedom from fear. The fear of being detained or banned from the Temple Mount for simply acting Jewish, or the fear for my life every time I ascend to the Temple Mount for simply being Jewish. And why? To appease the American administration, a country which is neither our colonial overlord nor to whom Israel is bound as a client state. To appease the United Nations, an international body who's rendered itself irrelevant as a result of its blatant policy of bias against Israel, or through the appointment of such freedom-loving luminaries as Saudi Arabia and Libya to positions of power in its Human Rights Council. To appease an irrelevant monarch in Jordan, descendant from a long line of terror-toting tyrants, to appease Hamas, Hezbollah, or the millions of Muslims around the world for whom the Temple Mount is not the first nor the second, but the third holiest site in Islam. Although I am not old enough to remember, as a Jew, I will never forget where appeasement leads us, and I will never again permit our enemies to be appeased. And that is why 1 year ago, this very month, I launched On The Har, a tax-exempt U.S. and Israeli nonprofit organization for which I proudly serve as the co-founder and executive director of. Each and every single day that Jews are permitted on the Temple Mount, On The Har celebrates the mitzvah of ascension by leading inspirational tours and providing a meaningful spiritual experience for people of all ages, faiths, and backgrounds. Our mission is simple. Our focus is threefold: to increase ascension to the Temple Mount, to advocate for equal rights and access on the Temple Mount, and to expand awareness of the Temple Mount through meaningful, impactful, and approachable educational content. By reframing the issue of the Temple Mount in the context of human rights and reimagining the Temple Mount movement as a fight for human freedoms, my partner Rabbi Yehudah Levi and I, in just 1 year's time, have become a trusted source for information about the Temple Mount, and as a result, we have fundamentally altered the perception of and prejudices held against the movement for equal rights on the Temple Mount and the need for Israeli sovereignty to be asserted over the Temple Mount. This is the most critical part of our strategy. For far too long, the Temple Mount movement has been defined, and perhaps rightfully so, as belonging to the religious fringe, ultra-nationalist, or Zionist zealots. For far too long, the Temple Mount movement, our movement, has been portrayed as one of domination and despotism, bent on the disenfranchisement of others, the destruction of Islamic holy sites, and the destabilization of the Middle East. But this is not now, nor has it ever been, the reality of our movement, because the Temple Mount has and always will be a house of prayer for all people, including our Muslim brothers and sisters. By redefining our movement as a human movement, a universal movement, a movement which seeks to secure freedom for all by establishing a home for us all, it therefore becomes incumbent upon us all people of faith and all civilized nations, to fight for equal rights on and access to the Temple Mount. Now, I recognize my goals are lofty, and I am not the first, nor will I be the last to play a role in this movement. But by building upon the achievements of the great men and women who came before us, like Talia and Yitzhak Amos, Gershon Solomon, and Rabbi Yehudah Glick, whose presence we will be blessed with today, and by recognizing where, why, and how the movement has failed to achieve its goals in the past, my partner, Rabbi Levi, and I firmly and fearlessly believe that we will and can see the establishment of the Third Temple in our time. And so I'd like to present to you a plan of action based on 4 fundamental principles, not unlike FDR's 4 freedoms, a plan which is accessible to anybody, and which hopefully everyone here today, or those of you watching online, will commit to undertaking. First, we must pursue our goals on a practical level. Before anything else can be achieved, we must secure the rights we've already won, wherein many of my friends and colleagues, for whom I have great respect and admiration for, demand that our government immediately institute full and total freedom of worship, all days and all hour access, entry or exit through every gate, the erection of a menorah during Hanukkah, the resumption of sacrifices and the building of the Mizbeach. It is totally unreasonable to believe at this time that this is possible. Even with the current government, whose coalition members include a far greater number of Temple Mount supporters than at any time before. I propose a more straightforward and far more justifiable agenda, one which I believe our leaders would be hard-pressed to ignore. Simply put, the Israeli government must recognize that the facts on the ground at the Temple Mount have radically changed over the past few years, and therefore the government policies pertaining to the Temple Mount should reflect the reality on the ground. Because the truth is, prayer is happening on the Temple Mount. Every day, Jews are permitted to ascend. Yeshiva Har Bait, the organization that inspired me to create On The Har, leads 3 daily minyans, 2 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, attended by no less than 10 worshipers and at times as many as 30, 40, or more. These prayer services occur year-round, regardless of whether it rains or snows, or if the temperature is as blazing hot as the riots which occur there, neither of which deter us. Generally, our services include audible prayers, Torah lessons, and every morning the Birchat Kohanim, sometimes featuring as many as 6 or more of our Kohanes in the group. Our prayer services proceed uninterrupted by the Israel police, many, if not most, who have come to the realization that we, the Jewish people, are not the problem on the Temple Mount, and some who even empathize with our cause and have admitted to being troubled by the orders they are given to restrict our prayers or remove us from the Mount for doing so. Because by not securing the rights we have won, rights we take full advantage of every day, the discrepancy between the policy of the Israeli government to restrict Jewish prayer and empower the police to prevent us from praying, when in reality they no longer enforce this prohibition, ensures that at any time and for any reason, what we are now doing on the Temple Mount and have been for the past few years can be taken from us without reason or warning as a result of a national election, a shift in political strategy, or simply a change in police command. We've worked too hard and come too far to allow that to happen. Second, we must pursue our goals on a political level. We must continue to support those politicians and their parties who commit to securing equal rights and access to the Temple Mount, while persuading those who do not yet stand with us that in so doing, they are securing Israeli democracy for generations to come and upholding the fundamental freedoms for which our democracy and the history of the Jewish people have always stood. We must increase pressure on allied governments to support Israel's indigenous rights over the Temple Mount, while demanding they reject the detrimental declarations of the United Nations and other irrelevant international bodies who have simply no jurisdiction over Israel and who seek to undermine Jewish rights in the Jewish state by legitimizing the action of terrorist entities who employ violence and destruction as a means to achieve their heinous and hateful ends. Third, we must pursue our goals on a personal level. Each and every one of us must undertake the task of being our own light unto the nations by educating others about the Temple Mount, by sharing the truth about the atrocities occurring on the Temple Mount, and by pushing back against those who claim we are the problem, that we have no right to this place, or that ascension is prohibited by Jewish law. Because the fight is not brought to us only by our enemies. Sadly, it is also waged by those within our own community. The very many religious Jews who fail to understand the halakha and deny the very fact that ascension is not only permitted, but fulfills 5 mitzvot, and that it has been a constant part of Jewish life since Adam and Eve offered the first sacrifice to God, built the very first altar, constructed upon the very same stone which today lies under the Dome of the Rock. We must fight against the rabbinate of Israel, who for purely political reasons allows a sign to be hung at the entrance of the Temple Mount, warning Jews that ascension is prohibited by Torah law, yet fails to cite upon which law his ruling rests, thus providing our enemies with perhaps the greatest weapon they wield against us. We must fight back those Jews who say I am the problem, that it is me who is fanning the flames and inciting violence, by visiting the site of our God's holy house and praying to him there, because it upsets the sensitive, the delicate sensibilities of our Muslim brothers and sisters. Many are completely unaware that Al-Aqsa does not bear a golden dome, but are entirely convinced that I am storming their mosque to perform Talmudic rituals every day. Let me be clear, I have not now, nor will I ever storm Al-Aqsa, or any other mosque for that reason. Storm is what clouds do, and Jews do not enter houses of worship belonging to other faiths. Furthermore, there is no such thing as a Talmudic ritual. But if there was, and it was prescribed by God to perform it on Temple Mount, you best believe I'd be doing it without remorse or reservation each and every single moment of the day. But most importantly, we must fight back against the Israeli government, our elected officials, who not only trample on my fundamental human rights, but have institutionalized a policy of targeted discrimination based on my Jewish and many of your Christian religious beliefs. This is more commonly known as apartheid. Because if there's one thing we can agree upon with our enemies, is that Israel is an apartheid state. But it is only for the Jews and the Christians on the Temple Mount that this apartheid exists. Now, this seemingly monumental task of fighting back is easier than you think, and it requires that you do just one thing, and that is to ascend. Ascend to the Temple Mount as often as possible and bring with you as many people as you can. Because if there's one thing the government cannot ignore, it is the growing numbers of visitors to the Temple Mount and their increasingly loud complaints about the limited access to the Temple Mount, the lack of equal rights on the Temple Mount, and the arbitrary enforcement of government policies regarding the Temple Mount. If the lines were as long and the demand as great as it is on the holidays, the festivals, Rosh Chodesh, or any of our national holidays, the government would have no choice but to expand the hours and increase the days which we are permitted to ascend. I don't say this casually. I have been told this directly by those in a position to know, in a position to affect policy, and in a position to enforce any changes made to it. It is critical we normalize our presence on the Temple Mount, otherwise it will not be normal for us to be there, and it will once again be taken from us. And it is critical we express how much we care for the Temple Mount. Because if we do not care for our holy sites, how can we expect our enemies to? If we do not bear witness to the atrocities occurring on the Temple Mount, the destruction of antiquities, the erasure of Jewish history, the ongoing acts of violence incited by the Islamic Waqf, the Kingdom of Jordan, and the terrorist elements infiltrating peace-loving Muslims, then we will never know what has been lost and thus cannot reclaim it in the future. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, we must pursue our goal by wielding the greatest weapon in our arsenal, prayer. We may no longer live in a time of prophecy, and Bezrat Hashem, may we merit to see those days again, but we do indeed live in a time of prayer. The pundits tell us that global faith is waning, organized religion has lost its influence, and some have even pronounced that God is dead. But we know better. The Zohar states that before the sun of redemption shines upon us, trouble after trouble and darkness after darkness will befall us. We, those of us with great faith, know that in the days before our redemption, the challenges will be harder than ever because the reward thereafter will be far greater than we can imagine. And if there was ever a time in human history in which trouble after trouble and darkness after darkness has befallen us, I posit that time feels like it might just be right now. And that is why prayer, your prayer, is more important than ever. And that is why twice daily, 5 days a week, Jewish prayer services occur directly in front of the gates in Ignore, the very place where for centuries Jews have prayed to God, and where King Solomon himself, upon consecrating the first temple, called out to God not only for the Temple Mount to be where the prayers of the Jewish people were heard, but where the prayers of all people were heard, and most importantly, answered. But we cannot bring about a house of prayer for all nations if we're not committed to practicing what we preach. All of us know the power of prayer. We understand that when we call out to God, we are heard, even if we are not always answered. So maybe it's time for all of us to pray a bit harder and pray a bit louder and pray with a bit more commitment and conviction than we ever have before. People all the time ask me, why do I get up every day at 4 a.m., leaving my gorgeous beachfront home in Tel Aviv in order to arrive in Jerusalem by 7 to participate in a prayer service at a place as dangerous as the Temple Mount? Because I believe wholeheartedly and without reservation in the power of prayer. And because Friday night's terrorist attack, which occurred directly in front of my home, precisely at the spot where I walk my 3 dogs each night, at the exact time it occurred, is a stark reminder that as a Jew, I am as much a target in Tel Aviv as I am on the Temple Mount. The only difference is on the Temple Mount, I am blessed to travel with an entourage of Israel police officers who I know will protect and defend me at all costs when the time comes. But more importantly, I know that my prayers are nothing compared to what my ancestors did so that I could be here today in Israel speaking to you after having just ascended to the Temple Mount this morning along with 2 members of our audience today. My actions on behalf of the Temple Mount do not even register in comparison to those of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph, to whom God first spoke and to whom the task was given to teach the world about the existence of the one true God. My work fighting for the Temple Mount is insignificant in light of Moshe's bravery in going before Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and demanding that the Jewish people be let go. My 2-hour, sometimes 3-hour drive, depending on traffic, to the Temple Mount each morning and every afternoon is hardly an excuse to forego my responsibility to ascend, especially when my forefathers and mothers walked around the Sinai for 40 years before conquering Canaan on the promise of victory from a voice in the sky. My early mornings on the Temple Mount and resulting late nights at the office, often with little or no sleep, like right now, are hardly a sacrifice compared to those Jews who altered the course of history and laid the foundations for modern civilization by committing to 10 simple rules handed down to them on stone tablets, and whom twice built a house for God in order to serve him unconditionally, and as a result, were honored with centuries of exile, enslavement, extermination, endemic persecution, and were nearly erased from the earth entirely. Prayer is thus the very least I can do. It's the very least any of us can do. Growing up in a Reformed Jewish community, I was told not to worry about 1/3 of the mitzvot, because without the temple, they don't really matter. But I wonder if perhaps the problem is precisely the fact that we have cast aside 1/3 of the commandments by refusing to fulfill the one commandment which would allow us to fulfill them all. And now as a member of a more religious community in Israel, I am warned that my actions, my desire to build the 3rd temple, will destabilize the region and cause a global war. But I wonder if perhaps building the temple is what will stabilize the region, what will ensure global peace. Because I look around me, and this region already seems pretty unstable, and the war, as the last 3 months here in Israel has illustrated, is already here. because we must stop to consider why the world is the way it is today. And if it's a result of our refusal to acknowledge our responsibility, accept our duty, and heed God's commandments. For as the Lord said to the prophet Haggai, is it a time for you to dwell in your paneled houses while this house is lying in ruins? Consider how you have been faring. You've sowed much and brought in little. You eat without being satisfied. You drink without getting your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one gets warm. And he who earns anything earns it for a leaky purse. You've been expecting much and getting little. Because of my house, which lies in ruins, while you all hurry to your own houses. Go up to the hills and get timber and rebuild the house. Then I will look on it with favor, and I will be glorified. I refuse to be a part of the generation that turns its back on God, because we are as close as we have ever been at any time in almost 2,000 years. And so we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to do right now to build the third temple? Because I promise you, it is not going to build itself. It is time we transform the concept of the Temple Mount from being just a part of our ancient past or a promise of a far future. We must make the Temple Mount as much a part of our present day, our current reality, as the prayers we pray when praying for it. As people of faith, we believe in miracles far more fantastic than this. A plague-stricken Egypt, a parted sea, manna from heaven, that I saw you at Sinai, commandments from on high, forged in stone, that the resurrection will happen, that we will once again be reunited with our loved ones, and that we will be rewarded for our good deeds in the world to come. So what is so hard to believe that a temple can be built in the center of Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the biblical homeland of the Jewish people, in a place where it twice stood before? And why is it so hard to believe that we are the generation we've been waiting for, and that right now is the time for which we've been waiting? Rambam's 12 principles of faith bind us to the belief in the coming of the Mashiach and the understanding that although he may delay, nonetheless he may appear at any moment. And although I would never dare revise the words of the greatest scholar of the Jewish people, to whom we turn to for an understanding of our entire halakha, I would humbly suggest an amendment or maybe perhaps a footnote be inserted. Because I believe with great faith in the reestablishment of the third temple, and even though we have delayed in building it, nonetheless, I believe at any moment it is possible for us to do so. So let that moment be right now. For as FDR reminds us, this is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and in our own generation. So may you all merit to see the building of the third temple and the coming of the Mashiach. But until then, may God continue to bless the Jewish people, the great state of Israel, and may God bless each and every one of you.
Wow. Don't know what to say after that. I think that really struck a chord with many of us here, and the passion and desire that we want to see for the future of the state of Israel and for God's holy mountain. May it be in our time. Dr. Kronfeld, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I highly encourage those in our audience, those watching online, to book a tour with On The Har. You will get a very, very impactful tour of the Temple Mount. Dr. Kronfeld's partner is an Orthodox Jew, rabbi, who has a lot of insight and wisdom to share with the visitors that go up. And I highly recommend going up on the Temple Mount with On The Har. I can say that I have a shared passion and view in alignment with what they believe, and that is very rare actually in Israel. And so thank you so much for coming. Our next speaker is going to be not doctor, but hopefully one day. He's working on his degrees here. John Enarson, would you please come up here?
It's good to see you all again, and thank you for that, MJ, Dr. Melissa Kronfeld.